The surgery was supposed to take 4 hours. It took 6. And somewhere inside those extra 2 hours, while I was unconscious on an operating table in a hospital gown with my name written in marker on my wrist, my daughter-in-law Sandra sat in a private attorney's office across town and quietly removed me from my son's will. I didn't find out until 3 weeks later. Not from Thomas. Not from Sandra. Not from anyone in the family. I found out because my own attorney, a quiet man named Gerald Holt, who had handled my affairs for 11 years, called me on a Tuesday morning while I was eating oatmeal at my kitchen table and said, very calmly, the way men say things when they already know the answer will hurt. Margaret, I think you need to come in. The Tuesday changed everything. But to understand why, you need to understand what happened before the surgery. Before Sandra. Before Thomas stopped calling on Sundays. You need to understand who I was before I became a woman someone thought they could erase. I turned 68 the spring my husband Robert died. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Robert died the way good men sometimes do. Slowly, quietly, with more grace than any of us deserved to witness. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the morning, I held his hand in our bedroom while the sun came through the curtains the same way it always had, indifferent and beautiful and completely unbothered by grief. We had been married for 41 years. I met Robert at a hardware store in Dayton, Ohio. He was buying the wrong kind of paint. I told him so. He laughed, asked if I was an expert, and I told him I had renovated 2 houses and raised 1 difficult younger brother. So yes, I probably qualified. He asked me to dinner before I reached the end of the aisle. That was 1979. We built everything together, not metaphorically. Literally. Robert was a contractor. I ran the books. We started with 1 small crew and a borrowed truck and eventually grew into a regional construction company that employed 43 people at its peak. We built homes, schools, a county library, 2 churches. We built a life that felt solid in the way only things made slowly ever do. Thomas was born in 1983, our only child. He had Robert's eyes and my stubbornness, and for the first 30 years of his life, that combination worked beautifully. Thomas was smart, determined, loyal. He coached youth baseball on weekends. He called every Sunday at 7. He remembered my birthday without a reminder for 35 consecutive years. Then he met Sandra. I want to be careful here because I spent a long time asking myself whether I simply disliked Sandra for ordinary reasons. Whether I was one of those mothers, the difficult kind, the possessive kind, the kind who turns every daughter-in-law into a rival without realizing it. I asked myself that question honestly. More than once. The answer was no. Sandra wasn't someone I disliked out of jealousy. Sandra was someone I watched carefully and worried about the way you worry when you notice a small crack in a foundation. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just wrong in a way that matters later. She was polished. Effortlessly polished. The kind of woman who arrives at casual Sunday dinners looking like she just stepped out of a magazine, while somehow making you feel underdressed in your own kitchen. She had a talent for redirecting conversations away from anything that didn't center her. She remembered compliments but forgot apologies. She called me Margaret instead of Mom even after I gently mentioned Thomas's first wife had always used Mom. Thomas had been briefly married before. 18 months, no children, a mutual parting of ways that left him sad but not broken. That woman, Caroline, had genuinely tried to be family. Sandra was interested in something different. But Thomas loved her. Completely. Blindly. The way men sometimes love women who make them feel chosen. And so I kept my concerns to myself. That was my mistake. The first one. Robert passed away on a Wednesday morning in April. Thomas arrived within 2 hours. He sat beside me on the porch for the rest of that day without saying much. Just there. Present. That was the Thomas I raised. A man who understood that sometimes love means simply occupying the same space as grief. Sandra arrived later that afternoon with a casserole dish and a very organized folder. The folder contained information about estate attorneys, financial advisors, funeral arrangements, and timelines for probate proceedings. All color-coded. All labeled. I remember staring at that folder while Thomas hugged me in the kitchen. I remember thinking, Robert died 6 hours ago. But I didn't say that. I accepted the casserole. I thanked her for thinking ahead. And I filed the moment away in the part of my mind where I kept things I wasn't ready to examine yet. Robert's estate was significant but not complicated. We had planned carefully together. The construction company had been sold 8 years earlier when Robert's health first began declining, and the proceeds, combined with 40 years of disciplined savings, had produced a comfortable inheritance. Our home in Columbus was paid off. There were investment accounts, retirement funds, and a small property in Western Virginia that had belonged to Robert's family for 3 generations. Everything was left to me, straightforwardly, without conditions. Thomas was named secondary beneficiary, meaning if I passed first, everything would transfer to him. Standard estate planning for a couple our age. Gerald Holt had drawn it up himself a decade earlier and updated it every few years as our circumstances changed. Sandra knew about the estate. How much she knew, I only understood later. 6 months after Robert died, I started experiencing chest pain. I ignored it the first week. The second week, I told myself it was grief. The third week, I mentioned it to my doctor during a routine appointment and was immediately referred to a cardiologist. The cardiologist found a narrowing in 2 coronary arteries significant enough to require surgery. Not emergency surgery. Scheduled. Careful. The kind of procedure that sounded terrifying on paper but had a very high success rate, according to the surgeon. A calm woman named Dr. Reyes who spoke to me the way capable people speak when they want you to trust them. Directly and without unnecessary comfort. I scheduled the surgery for late October. Thomas came to Columbus the night before. Just Thomas. Sandra, he explained, was managing a work situation she couldn't postpone. I told him it was fine. I meant it. I didn't need Sandra at the hospital. Honestly, her absence felt like a small mercy. We had dinner at the kitchen table the night before my surgery. Chicken soup I'd made myself because Thomas always said mine was the only soup worth eating when something frightening was happening. We talked about Robert. About old vacations. About the summer Thomas was 12 and convinced himself he was going to play professional baseball until a fastball broke his finger at camp. We laughed. Real laughter. It was the last easy evening we had for a very long time. The next morning, Thomas drove me to the hospital. He held my hand in the pre-op room until they asked him to step out. His face when he let go of my hand. I still think about that face, worried and trying not to show it. My son, at 59 years old, still looking sometimes like the boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. I'll be right here, he said. I know, I told him. The anesthesia pulled me under quickly. I didn't know yet that while I slept, Sandra had already gotten on a plane. I woke up in recovery feeling like someone had rearranged my chest from the inside. Thomas was there when I opened my eyes. He looked exhausted in the way people look when they've been waiting for news in a hospital corridor for 6 hours without eating. He smiled immediately when I focused on him. Hey, Mom. Did it work? It worked. I slept again almost immediately. The next 2 days blurred together in the particular fog of post-surgical recovery. Nurses, monitors, Gel-O in small plastic cups, the sound of the hallway outside my room carrying on with ordinary hospital business while I lay still and waited for my body to remember what normal felt like. Thomas stayed through the first day. He had to return to Cincinnati for work obligations by day 2, but called twice daily and arranged for my neighbor Dorothy to check on me once I returned home. Sandra called once, a single call, 4 minutes. She asked how the surgery went, said she was glad it was successful, mentioned she'd had a crazy week at work, and ended the call with a breezy, let us know if you need anything. Let us know. Like I was a package requiring delivery confirmation. I didn't think much about it at the time. I was recovering. I was tired. I was slowly working through the grief of losing Robert while simultaneously managing my own health and the particular loneliness of a large, quiet house that used to contain 2 people. I wasn't thinking about estate documents. I wasn't thinking about attorneys. I wasn't thinking about Sandra. I should have been. Gerald Holt called on a Tuesday. I remember the oatmeal. Blueberries on top. Robert used to say I put too many blueberries, but I always told him there was no such thing. Gerald's voice was careful in that particular way attorneys sound when they are managing news before delivering it. Margaret, I've received some paperwork that concerns me. I'd like you to come in as soon as you're feeling well enough. What kind of paperwork? A brief pause. Documents connected to Thomas's estate planning. There have been some changes filed in the past few weeks. Thomas's estate planning, not mine. Thomas's. My oatmeal cooled while I sat very still at the kitchen table processing that sentence. When can you come in? Thursday, I said. Thursday is fine. I set the phone down carefully. Then I sat for a long time looking out the kitchen window at the backyard, where Robert's bird feeders still hung from the oak tree. I filled them every Saturday morning. Habit, mostly. Maybe something else. I didn't call Thomas. Something stopped me. Not suspicion exactly. More like the quiet instinct older women develop after enough years of watching. The sense that you should understand a situation fully before you begin reacting to it. Thursday arrived. I drove myself to Gerald's office in downtown Columbus, second floor, above an insurance company. I'd been coming to that office for over a decade. Gerald's assistant, a young woman named Patricia, brought me coffee without asking because she already knew how I took it. Gerald came in carrying a folder. He sat across from me and opened it without preamble because that was his way. Gerald Holt had never been a man who softened difficult things with unnecessary words. 3 weeks ago, he said, an estate attorney in Cincinnati filed updated documentation connected to Thomas's personal will and asset trust. The changes were significant. He turned the folder toward me. Your name has been removed as a beneficiary from Thomas's estate. I looked at the documents. I looked at the date. The filing date was the day of my surgery. I set my coffee down very carefully. Sandra initiated the changes. Gerald continued. Thomas signed. Both signatures are present and notarized. Thomas signed. Those two words sat in the room like something heavy that had been dropped from a height. Is there a reason given? The documentation cites an updated estate strategy to consolidate assets within the immediate household. Gerald's voice stayed professionally neutral. Standard language used when someone wants the change to appear routine, but it isn't routine. No. I looked back at the papers. At Thomas's signature. His handwriting. The same handwriting that signed birthday cards and baseball camp registration forms and his marriage certificate. What was removed exactly? Gerald listed it quietly, Thomas's estate, while not as substantial as Robert's, contained the Virginia property. Robert's family land, 3 generations deep. Along with significant investment accounts, life insurance, and a property in Cincinnati Thomas had purchased 10 years earlier as a rental. All of it redirected. All of it restructured into a joint trust controlled primarily by Sandra in the event of Thomas's death. I sat with that information for a long moment. Then I asked the question that mattered. Gerald, when we updated my documents 2 years ago after Robert's health declined, did we do what I think we did? Gerald looked at me over his glasses. Then, very quietly, he smiled. Yes, Margaret, we did. This requires some explanation. 2 years before Robert died, during a period when his illness had become serious enough that we were thinking carefully about every document and every decision, Gerald and I had a conversation about the Virginia property specifically. Robert's family land, 47 acres in the Shenandoah Valley. His grandfather had purchased it in 1931. It had stayed in the family through 4 generations by a combination of intention and stubbornness. Robert loved that land the way people love things that connect them to people they've lost. He went there every fall, just to walk it, just to remember. When Robert died, the property transferred to me directly as stipulated in our joint estate plan. But during that planning conversation 2 years earlier, Gerald had raised a quiet concern. If something happens to you, Margaret, and Thomas inherits the property through normal succession, is there anything you'd want protected? Any conditions? I had thought about that for a long moment, and then I'd remembered Sandra's color-coded folder, her organized timelines, the way she spoke about Robert's estate at the dinner table 6 months after we buried him. Not cruelly, but specifically. Numbers and structures. Assets and values. I'd thought about the Virginia land. Robert's grandfather's land. And I had said to Gerald, yes. Actually. There is. What we created was a conditional protection clause embedded within my own estate documents. Not complicated. Not aggressive. Simply structured. The Virginia property, upon my death, would transfer to Thomas, but only under a specific condition. If Thomas's own estate documents did not include provisions protecting the land's original family designation, the property would instead transfer to a designated preservation trust Gerald and I had established for exactly that purpose. In plain language, Sandra couldn't inherit that land. Not directly. Not through Thomas. Not by removing me from documents while I was unconscious in a hospital. The land would be protected regardless. But that wasn't all. Because Gerald, being Gerald, had also spent the past 3 weeks doing something else entirely. I didn't only look at what was removed from Thomas's documents. Gerald told me. I set my coffee cup down. I looked at how those changes were made. He opened a second section of the folder. Sandra retained an attorney in Cincinnati named Douglas Mara. Mr. Mara specializes in estate restructuring. Gerald paused.
He also has a noted history of aggressive asset consolidation on behalf of second spouses in blended family situations. Is that unusual? Choosing him specifically? No. The timing, however, is. Gerald laid 3 documents on the desk side by side. The first was Sandra's initial consultation record with Douglas Mara, dated 4 months before my surgery. The second was a series of emails, obtained through proper legal channels, between Mara's office and Sandra discussing the structure of the changes. The third was a document I had to read twice before I fully understood. Sandra had initiated the process of removing me from Thomas's estate 4 months before my surgery. My surgery had simply provided the timing, a window when I would be unreachable, possibly disoriented during recovery, and when changes could be filed and settled before I became aware of them. She had planned it, not impulsively, not reactively, deliberately. Over months, there's one more thing, Gerald said. He slid a final document across the desk. 3 months ago, Sandra also made inquiries. Preliminary only, nothing filed. About challenging the Virginia property transfer from Robert's estate to you. Everything in the room went very quiet. On what grounds? She argued that Robert's estate planning may not have adequately accounted for Thomas's interests as the sole child. Gerald looked at me directly. It was a weak argument, and she likely knew it. But it told me she was already looking at every asset connected to you and Robert. I sat with all of that for a long time. Outside Gerald's window, Columbus moved through an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Traffic. People. Ordinary American life continuing in the way it does, completely indifferent to the moments inside rooms where everything shifts. Finally, I spoke. What are my options? Gerald folded his hands on the desk. Several, he said. But first I want to ask you something. Go ahead. Do you want to protect your assets? Or do you want to protect your son? I looked at him. Those aren't mutually exclusive. No, he agreed. But the approach changes depending on which one comes first. I thought about Thomas's face in the hospital pre-op room. His hand letting go of mine. The worry he tried to hide. I thought about Sandra on the plane to wherever she had gone while I was in surgery. I thought about Robert's Virginia land. His grandfather's land. 4 generations of a family that built something honest and meant for it to last. Then I answered. My son, I said. Thomas comes first. Always. Gerald nodded once. Then we do this carefully, he said. I did not call Thomas immediately. I went home. I made dinner. I sat in the living room in Robert's old chair and thought for a very long time about what I actually knew versus what I felt. What I knew. Sandra had planned the removal of my name from Thomas's documents over months. She had executed it during my surgery. She had made preliminary inquiries about challenging Robert's estate. What I felt. My son had signed those papers. That was the part I kept returning to. Thomas had signed. Not under duress, presumably. Not without understanding. He had placed his name on a document that removed his mother from his estate while his mother was recovering from heart surgery. Part of me wanted a reason, an explanation that made it forgivable, that he hadn't fully read the documents, that Sandra had minimized what was being changed, that he signed quickly, trusting her, not realizing the scope. Part of me was simply hurt in the quiet, particular way mothers get hurt when children disappoint them. Not with anger, but with a kind of tired sadness that feels worse. I called Dorothy next door and asked if she wanted to come for tea. Dorothy was 74, had survived 2 husbands, and a complicated relationship with her own daughter-in-law, and had the particular wisdom of someone who had already lived through most of the things I was just encountering. She came over immediately. I told her everything. Dorothy drank her tea quietly for several minutes after I finished. Then she said, the question isn't whether Sandra is calculating. She clearly is. The question is whether Thomas knows. He signed the documents. Men sign things, Sandra hands them. Dorothy set down her cup. That doesn't mean he understood what he was doing. That's almost worse. Yes. She nodded. It is. We sat together while the evening came in slowly through the windows. Then Dorothy said, what would Robert do? I thought about my husband. His steadiness, his patience, his absolute inability to stay angry at Thomas for more than 48 hours regardless of the situation. He'd go see him. I said. Dorothy smiled. Well then, I drove to Cincinnati on a Saturday. I didn't call ahead. I wasn't entirely sure what I would say if I called. Some conversations need to arrive before they can be planned. Thomas and Sandra lived in a large colonial in a neighborhood of large colonials where every lawn looked professionally managed, and every driveway contained 2 expensive vehicles. Sandra's was the cream-colored one. Of course. Thomas answered the door, his face when he saw me. Surprise first, then something softer, then something that flickered across his eyes too quickly for me to name. Mom, I didn't know you were coming. I know. Can I come in? Of course. Sandra appeared from the kitchen almost immediately. She had that quality some people possess, a kind of environmental awareness, a radar for situations requiring management. She smiled warmly, the practiced kind. Margaret, this is a surprise. You should have called. I was in the area, I said pleasantly. We sat in the living room. Sandra offered coffee. I accepted. There is something useful about the ordinary rituals of hospitality. They give everyone time to settle into their positions before anything real begins. Thomas looked at me carefully while Sandra was in the kitchen.
You okay? The surgery recovery going well? Much better. Thank you for being there. Of course. He paused. Sandra had a work thing. I know. She mentioned. Sandra returned with 3 mugs arranged on a small tray. She sat beside Thomas on the sofa with the comfortable closeness of a woman who had learned to stay physically adjacent to her husband in the presence of his mother. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important. Weather. Thomas's work. A renovation project he was managing. I let the conversation breathe naturally because I'd learned long ago that urgency announces itself too quickly and gives people time to prepare defenses. Then, softly, I said, Thomas, I visited Gerald Holt this week. A pause. Sandra's coffee mug moved very slightly in her hand. A small movement. The kind people make when they receive unexpected information and are trying not to show it. Thomas's expression became careful. Oh, he had some documents to review with me, related to your estate planning. I kept my voice completely neutral. There were some changes filed recently. Thomas looked at Sandra briefly. Just briefly. But I saw it. Sandra spoke first. We did some updating, yes. Douglas suggested consolidating everything for simplicity. Douglas. First name. Comfortable. Of course, I said. Gerald mentioned Douglas Mayer. I looked at Thomas. Did you review all the changes carefully before signing? Another pause. Longer this time. Sandra handled most of the coordination. I'm sure she did. I smiled gently. I'm asking if you read everything. Thomas set his mug down slowly. The room held a particular quality of silence now, not hostile, just honest. The kind of silence that exists when everyone in a room knows the conversation has moved to a place where pretending isn't useful anymore. What specifically are we talking about, Mom? I looked at him directly. My son. 59 years old. Robert's eyes. My stubbornness. I was removed from your estate documents, I said quietly. While I was in surgery. Thomas went completely still. Sandra immediately began. That's a simplification of, while I was in surgery, Thomas. I kept my eyes on my son. Not unkindly, but steadily. The filing date is the same day as my procedure. Thomas looked at Sandra. And in that look, in the particular shape of that moment, I finally had my answer. He hadn't known, or he hadn't fully known, or he had known in the surface way people know things when someone they trust has explained it to them in carefully chosen language. Sandra's voice shifted slightly. Still controlled, but tighter. The timing was simply when Douglas could file. It had nothing to do with Sandra. Thomas's voice was quiet. Very quiet. She stopped. Did you file these while my mother was in surgery? The timing was. Yes or no? The room breathed. The appointment had been scheduled, Sandra said carefully. Thomas stood up from the sofa. I stayed in Cincinnati that night at Thomas's insistence. Sandra retreated to their bedroom early, citing a headache. Thomas and I sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight the way we used to sit at our kitchen table in Columbus when he was young and something was bothering him, and he needed to talk but didn't know yet how to start. He told me everything. Sandra had presented the estate changes as routine simplification. She had used language like consolidation and efficiency and clarity. She had told him that having me listed separately complicated matters unnecessarily and that Gerald Holt was from a different era of estate planning that no longer reflected current best practices. Thomas had signed because he trusted her, because he hadn't been trained to question, because good men who love the wrong people sometimes stop thinking in the particular places where those people have learned to fill in the gaps. I didn't know about the Virginia property, he said. The changes would have affected it eventually. He was quiet for a long time. Grandpa's land, yes. Thomas rubbed both hands over his face. Robert's gesture. Something that moved through me painfully. I didn't know, Mom. I believe you. That's not enough. I should have. No, I said. But it's where we start. We talked for a long time after that. About Sandra. About the pattern I had watched build slowly over years. About the particular way control arrives in marriages, not as sudden violence, but as gradual replacement. Of judgment, of instinct, of independent thought. Thomas listened the way he used to listen as a boy when truth was arriving. And he was old enough to understand it, but not quite ready to hold it comfortably. Before we went to sleep, he asked me something. What does Gerald recommend? Several options, I said. But that depends on what you want. He looked at me. I want to fix this, he said. Then we start Monday. What followed was not dramatic. I want to be honest about that because stories about betrayal and family and money tend to collapse into moments of public confrontation and declarations made in doorways. Real life usually arrives more quietly. Thomas retained his own attorney, separately from Douglas Mayer, separately from Sandra's counsel. Gerald and Thomas's new attorney worked together across the following weeks to understand the full structure of what had been filed and what could be revisited. The Virginia property was protected regardless, due to the clause Gerald and I had established 2 years earlier. That land was never actually at risk. But Thomas didn't know that when he decided to fix things. He moved to fix them because it was the right thing to do, not because of the land, because of me. That mattered more than any document. Sandra's reaction to Thomas retaining separate counsel was the thing that finally clarified everything beyond argument. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She hired her own attorney within 48 hours and began documenting what she described as Thomas's sudden irrational behavior under his mother's undue influence. Undue influence. The legal term used when someone wants to suggest that an elderly person has manipulated a younger one. Gerald found that particularly interesting. Because Sandra had filed her first consultation with Douglas Mayer 4 months before my surgery. Before Thomas had spent any significant time with me. Before any of the conversations we were now having. The documented timeline told a story that had nothing to do with my influence and everything to do with Sandra's. Thomas saw the timeline. He sat with it for 3 days. Then he made his decision. I won't detail the legal proceedings fully here, because some things belong to Thomas and not to me. But I will say that within 4 months, the documents Sandra had filed were fully revisited. My name was restored. The Virginia property's protection was formally acknowledged and documented. Sandra contested everything she could. Her attorney was efficient and expensive. It didn't change the outcome. Gerald told me afterward over coffee in his office that the documentation Sandra's own attorney had generated in her defense had inadvertently confirmed several things that strengthened Thomas's position considerably. Meticulous planning, it turns out, also produces meticulous records. Thomas and Sandra separated the following spring. I didn't celebrate that. I want to be clear about that. I had never wanted my son's marriage to fail. I had wanted my son to see clearly. Those aren't the same wish. Thomas moved into an apartment in Columbus for several months while things were finalized. We had Sunday dinners again. Nothing formal. Simple things. Soup, usually. Old stories. The particular comfort of being in a room with someone who has known you your entire life. He didn't talk about Sandra often. When he did, he was measured. He had the particular sadness of someone who has loved incorrectly. Not stupidly, just without full information. Did you know? He asked me once. From the beginning. I thought carefully before answering. I worried, I said. From the beginning. Knowing is different. He nodded slowly. I should have listened better. You were in love, I said. People in love develop particular kinds of deafness. It's not a character flaw. It's just human. Thomas was quiet. Dad would have figured it out faster. Your father had 40 years of practice reading people. I smiled. And he still occasionally misread them. That made Thomas laugh.
A real laugh. The kind I hadn't heard from him in longer than I wanted to think about. The Virginia property is still in the family. Thomas and I drove out there last October, the way Robert used to do every fall. The land looked exactly as it always had. 47 acres of Shenandoah Valley that had survived a depression and 2 world wars and 4 generations of a family that kept deciding it was worth holding on to. We walked the perimeter fence line the way Robert used to walk it. Slowly. Quietly. Taking inventory not of value but of meaning. Thomas stopped at the old oak near the eastern boundary. Robert had carved his initials there as a boy. They were still visible if you knew where to look. He ran his hand across the bark. Grandpa would have hated all of this, he said. Your grandfather hated conflict of any kind. I smiled. He also would have handled it the same way your father would have. How's that? Quietly, I said. And correctly. Thomas looked at me. You handled it quietly. I had help. We stood there together for a few minutes. Just standing. Just breathing cold October air while the Virginia hills rolled away from us in every direction, and the afternoon light came through the trees the way light comes through trees on land that has belonged to the same family long enough to feel like it knows you. I thought about Robert. About what it means to build something honest and want it to last. I thought about Gerald Holt, sitting in his office on a Tuesday morning waiting to tell me something he knew would hurt. I thought about the surgery. The 4 hours that became 6. The time I spent unconscious while someone else made decisions about my life. And I thought about something Grandma Eleanor, not mine, Robert's grandmother, used to say during her final years. She was a tiny woman who had outlived 2 sons and a husband and survived things no one in our family ever fully discussed. She used to sit in the kitchen and say, very simply, people who underestimate quiet women usually regret it. She said it pleasantly. Almost cheerfully. Like it was simply a fact of nature. Like water running downhill. I am 69 years old now. I live in the Columbus house. I still fill Robert's bird feeders every Saturday morning. I have dinner with Thomas on Sundays. Gerald Holt still handles my affairs from his second-floor office above the insurance company. Patricia still brings my coffee without asking. Some mornings I wake up and the house feels large in the way houses feel large when they were built for more people than currently occupy them. That's simply grief. It arrives differently every season. I've stopped trying to reason with it and started just letting it move through when it comes. But I am not lonely in the way people assume widows are lonely. I am alone sometimes. Those are different things. Here is what I know now that I didn't know before all of this. I know that protection isn't the same as control. I protected my family's land by planning ahead. I didn't control what Thomas chose or how his marriage ended. You can prepare for storms without manufacturing them. I know that quiet women are not passive women. I said very little during the years I watched Sandra carefully. That silence was not weakness. It was accuracy. I was learning the shape of something before deciding how to respond to it. I know that sons can lose their way and find it again. Thomas is not the man he was during those years when Sandra filled in the spaces where his own judgment used to live. He is closer now to the boy I raised and the man Robert helped shape. That recovery was his own. I only held the door. And I know that the most important documents are not the ones that record money. They are the ones that record love. The long kind. The kind Robert and I built across 41 years. The kind that prepared quietly for possibilities neither of us wanted to imagine. The kind that left Gerald Holt with a folder of protections I didn't fully understand until the Tuesday morning I sat at my kitchen table and ate oatmeal with too many blueberries and waited for something I didn't know was coming. That kind of love plans ahead. It always has. If this story meant something to you. If you've ever felt quietly erased by someone who assumed you weren't paying attention, I hope you carry this forward. The strongest protection you can build around what you love isn't anger. It's preparation. And quiet women who have loved long enough and paid close enough attention almost always prepare better than anyone expects. Thank you for being here. And if this found someone who needed it today, pass it on.